Hello, everyone. Here to do my Treasure Cup wrap up. So, after participating in four 1,000 player Treasure Cups, these are my findings with my deck of choice for those things on Robin. I'm just going to go over the deck lists real quick with some pros and cons for each of the deck lists that I ran, and then I'll hop over to a live and go through kind of what I'm thinking for Robin going forward after my experience. So starting off with the first list, this one was built with extra trigger bodies in it and designed to be pretty good into Doflamingo. And I think I hit that. One of the highlights of this deck that wasn't present in most other decks that I've seen is I was running 12 triggers that KO a character out of life. I think that was a little bit too much, but it was a good experiment and helped me kind of figure out where my lines were. So pros to this list, because of all the trigger bodies, there was a lot of free value. It ended up being quite flexible in that there were a lot of different things to do at different points in the game. But I felt like it was lacking a little bit and a little bit too much triggers, not enough actual on the board value. So going into cons then, like I mentioned, there was a limited board presence. When I was relying on triggers to cover me in the mid game, I ended up without too much board in the end game because those triggers often didn't come with the body. So especially if in the end game my top end got destroyed, I was kind of sitting without much board, and it was fall into the pattern of play a top end to heal one and then swing for 5 with leader and hold up Gum Gum Giant. And that wasn't sustainable in most matchups. Going along with that, it was just that one body per turn. There wasn't a lot of opportunities for double ability or double character abilities. So it was sometimes hard to finish through blockers, which some decks put up in abundance. Moving on to the version 2 list, this one I was trying out less trigger bodies, and I was really interested in trying out the Kuzan to deal with some of the little dorky dudes who came up and really were giving me issues. Out of Doflamingo, that would be your Sengokus and Peronas. Blackbeard, you have your Lafitte's, and various other kind of little dinky guys that get value and then are hard for you to dedicate resources to get rid of. So I was trying Kuzan with this list, and I was trying to up my numbers of that put into life effect, which was quite effective. I really liked Kuzan, and I added in some extra Lin-Lins to go with them. Pros to this list, like I said, Kuzan was really good, and was nice that you could play down a Kuzan in the mid game and then still swing with a larger amount of Dawn on your leader, which helped keep up some of the pressure. And then Gadatsu over some of the other trigger bodies to get that removal, plus having a nice body that didn't get trashed, like with an Egghead Luffy. Cons on this one, there was too few triggers in this one. So I did have some bricky hands at times, and it bit me a couple times, like Nami's not being able to be used. So I needed to make some changes for the next one. The other one is I'd taken out some of the card draw options from the prior version to this version. And so I noticed that I was running out of cards a little bit too early and didn't have quite enough pressure to finish in that amount of time. So I needed a little more staying power either through card draw or otherwise going into the next list. It brings it to the final list. I ran this for the third and fourth Treasure Cups. This one is kind of all over the place. I like a lot of the cards that are there. I think on refinement in this next list, we'll go through what worked from this list and kind of shave what didn't. So the higher trigger count versus the version 2 was good. This deck felt consistent the whole way through. I didn't feel like I was ever asking for more trigger cards. and Nami was consistently triggering her activated ability on play and out of trigger. I was also running more blockers and card draw, which helped me get the games to go longer and let me use my leader ability to exert more pressure over time. So in particular in this list, the Shanks games that I played, and I'll go over matchups after this, they felt way closer than they had in the prior two versions of the deck. So I think that this is approaching where we needed to get the deck to go. Just needs a little bit more, tuning to get there. So moving on to cons, this deck was still a little bit light on pressure. I felt like I was able to make the game last long enough, but I was unable to cross the finish line. Whereas if I had a couple more 7K bodies or a little bit more Dawn available, like if I could run 8 Nico Olvias, that would be ideal. I just need a little bit more to finish out the games. This was also possibly a play pattern issue. Kuzan and Linlin and Katakuri are all great when they are putting stuff into life, but there is a limit to how much you can put in your opponent's life before you harm your ability to finish the game. So one of the things I would need to do with this list going forward is learn the play patterns better and learn what is worth putting into life and what is worth ignoring, because I don't think I got it right every time. Cons on this list, other cons on this list, countering early I found was still a little bit difficult. As I mentioned in my overthinking my deck video, which I'll have linked in the description along with the other videos kind of going over my treasure cup lists. I mentioned that I was trying to counter a little earlier and be a little more aggressive with my gameplay. And I found that with this list, I still wasn't quite able to counter early enough. I don't know if I need a little bit more 2Ks maybe, or something to give me just a little bit more mileage out of my counter so that I can get to the end game with a little bit more life. In particular, against Shanks or a few other leaders, we would fall into a pattern where it was just stack everything on lead and swing. And I found that in those games, I was the one who was falling behind, partly because I was discarding cards to leader, but also because I was using 2Ks sometimes for those discards to leader effect. And that was a little bit too hard on my hand size. And so I wasn't able to counter as early as I would have liked. So those are the three lists that I ran. Next, we'll go over the matchups that I did. I ended up facing more Shanks than any other deck, which is unfortunate because that is a deck that I know is a poor matchup for Robin. 7 games I've faced them and didn't win any of them. I don't think the matchup is quite as unbalanced as it showed here. This is probably within normal variance, but I don't think that it's a 0% like never win matchup. It's just one that is quite difficult to navigate. And I think maybe with some more reps and some more practice around the Kuzan, Katakuri, Big Mom issues, then I might have been able to find a better rhythm against Shanks. But it is definitely a losing matchup, at least with any of the versions of the deck I've played. I have heard that some people have been having some success with the Charlotte, the Kaido and Linlin card, which I think is maybe a little too ambitious for the meta at large. But if you know you're going to be facing mostly Shanks, then I could see it. The next most frequent was Dofi. This is one of the decks that I went in hoping to beat, and I was very successful against them. Out of 5 games, I won 4 of them. I don't think the matchup is necessarily as positive as my results suggest. I think the matchup is probably a little closer to 60-65% in our favor. You have a really good time clearing board and getting into the end game where you can just remove things and swing at things, and you run a Dofi out of out of cards in hand, and then you can clean up the game with your top end, which is a pretty good place to be. Next most frequent I had was Teach. I do think I faced it 3 times and lost all 3 times. I do think that this one is closer than what I would say my results showed. All of the games against the Teach were literally down to the wire, down to the exact last card for the opponent. And I don't know if it was variance a little bit or misplays on my part. I know at least in one of those games, I had a pretty significant misplay that really put me out of contention early. I wasted a lot of cards in ways that wasn't where I needed to be. So the matchup I don't think is as bad as shown here. It is maybe 50-50, maybe slightly favored, but it definitely requires a little bit more fine-tuning of the deck. My final list maybe was not the best tuned for Teach, and I think that there was a lot of variance and probably misplays on my part that contributed. Next, BY Luffy. This is the other deck that I was really designing the deck around, especially in versions 2 and 3. And I faced it 3 times and beat it all 3 times. I think that it is one, again, like probably with most of these, none of the matchups that I faced in my win percentages are as polarizing as the matchups indicate. BY Luffy definitely struggles when you have access to Kuzan and Katakuri and Linlin, and you can really mess up their ability to go to 9K. The list that I posted as the grinding session on the sim with my friend, unfortunately I had to cut 2 games from that video where a Charlotte Linlin bug prevented us from finishing the game, and in both of those games I was in a pretty commanding lead, so that video didn't quite communicate the strength that the deck has in those matchups. I think it is probably maybe 60-65% in our favor, just because of how disruptive we can be, and the banish puts a real clock on BY Luffy's game plan. Against the Nell, I do think that this one is quite heavily favored for us. Not 100% for sure. Every deck can beat us with a good high roll or some good trigger luck or something like that. But banish is really effective at curtailing the power of Enel. They just don't get the access to all of their triggers. They can't do the trick where they hit one trigger on when you go for life and then it completely resets you. And our deck is full of top end, so it's hard for them to interact with our top end enough turns in a row to prevent us from getting that necessary 3 swings. I did beat it both of the times I played it. I didn't feel particularly under stress either time, but it is a grindy matchup that has plenty of places where you can lose if you get greedy or you misjudge their ability to counter out. So pretty heavily favored for us, but definitely losable. And one of the things, if you misplay, you can give it up. Lucci, I only faced it once and lost to it. This is a tougher matchup for us because of Moria. All of the hand pressure we get to exert with our leader is kind of undone by the Moria. And if they can fall into a loop where they're hitting multiple Morias into Rebecca's, the 1 card per play or per turn situation can really start to come up. And if we're not playing a top end and we're playing 2 bodies, Lucci is the one deck who is most capable of dealing with 2 bodies at once. So this one is unfavored for us, but is definitely winnable if they don't see too many Morias in the game, or if they mill them over or something like that. Next matchup, I faced Purple Luffy once and lost to it. This one is, I think, slightly unfavored for us. It really comes down a lot to who gets more Gum Gum Giants and who can take first on the die roll. They are slightly favored because their game plan is a little bit stronger on both. Not on both. They're very strong on first compared to us, and it's really hard to catch up. But if we do get to go first, they still have a significant enough game plan to where they can outsurvive us card-wise. So I think a deck tuned to beat Purple Luffy would need to be pretty heavy on card advantage, and you still obviously need to win the die roll. So unfavored for us, and I think my matchup is probably within reason. The final deck, RP Luffy, I faced it once and lost to it. This one is kind of like Shanks, but it trades the amount of life for the ability to get to their top end faster. I find it to be slightly easier than Shanks, mainly because the 3 life means that we get to exert extra pressure earlier in the game than with Shanks, because they will usually take that first one, and then you can really ram home your effects on 2 life. It is a Gum Gum Giant matchup. Sometimes they will draw enough Gum Gum Giants to be essentially unkillable, and sometimes you will draw enough Gum Gum Giants to essentially become unkillable. So it is definitely a matchup where the particular hands can make it, but I do think they are slightly favored just because they have those large bodies, which are hard for us to remove, and 2 life, while softer than with Shanks, when backed up with Gum Gum Giant and Radical Beam, it is still difficult to finish before their top end can beat our 4 life. So that is the matchups that I faced. Next, I'm going to cut over to Live Mat to go over the building of what I would do for the deck if I were building it with all of my current knowledge. And so let's hop over to that. All right, now on to the deck building portion of the video. Just before I get started, one thing that I want to call out. I'm only going to focus on the decks the cards that I think are the most viable, but that does not mean that other cards are not viable. If you have something that you want me to talk about or a question, just throw it down in the comments. I'll do my best to get to everyone's questions. And again, this is just my opinion. There are plenty of viable options that would work potentially in other lists, but this is the list of cards that I am trying and I think have worked out best in my experience. So to start off, let's do the 2K counters. They're core to the deck, and you're always going to have them. They're easy decisions to make in for the most part. So I focus on hitting about 12 to 14 2K counters, I think is probably where you want to be. And the 4 cards that I think are the most viable as far as 2K counters go are these 4 here. We have Frankie, Capone Gang, Vage, Nico Olvia, and Usohachi. I will refer you to and this will kind of go across all the categories. For in-depth discussions about all of the cards that I'm going to talk about, I'll point you to the description. I've got several different videos I've gone through throughout this set where I go over all of the cards in here, and I'll keep it briefer here. So first of these, Frankie. Actually, no, let's back up. First, we want to focus on is Nico Olvia. I think out of every card in the deck, this is the only one that is non-negotiable at a 4 of. Almost every other card I would say every other card in the deck, there's arguments to run less than 4 of, except for Nico Olvia. This card is, if you're running Robin, this is super important. It applies pressure. It has a good filtering trigger. It's discardable to your leader ability, and it works only for you. But it is perfect for the deck. I would never run a Robin deck with less than 4 of this, unless they power creep the heck out of the deck, in which maybe in the future. but at least for the foreseeable future, Nico Olvia is a guaranteed 4F. Going into the rest of the options here, Frankie and Beji, you want to make sure that you get enough of these to keep your 2K or your trigger counts high enough. I prefer Frankie a little bit over Beji. I found that way too often Beji is a poorly timed trigger. Every time Frankie successfully triggers, it is value. I do not trigger him if I'm not at if I'm not at a place where his body comes out. But every time that he does trigger at that point, I will play him out. Whereas Beji, there are definitely times where the 2K counter is worth more than the freeze. Most often, you guard out a little early, knowing that you can take the final life, and then suddenly you hit a Beji. I wish that it was more reliable that you could take life early. The issue is if you take life too early and you're banking on hitting counter and you miss, you may die for it. So a lot of times you have to counter early just so that you know you're not dead. And that counteracts kind of the Beji. The other 2K that I've really started to like is this Usohachi. I find this is one of the better ways to finish the game. You have one, maybe two top end cards on the field. Usohachi, Nico Olvia, these two synergize really nicely together, but tapping down their blocker that they rely on, and then getting through with Banish with your leader, and then they don't get the card, and then you get through with your top end cards. It's one of the more reliable ways to finish in games where it's close, your opponent is trying to set up behind blockers. I think the numbers that I would go with, after all that I have experienced, is 4 Olvia. So let's do this. We're going to have 4 Olvia. I do 3 Beji. You do 4 Frankie, and you do 2 Usohachi. So you leave these ones behind. This maximizes you're hitting, in this case, 13 2K counters, so it helps you counter out early just a smidge more. That was one thing that I was noticing in my prior list, is I wanted to counter out early, but I was cramped on actual counter, and so adding in one more, hoping that that is enough to kind of balance it out. One thing I'll mention as an aside, you're the one who can disappear, while not technically a 2K, often functions as a 2K, and if you find that you want to add even more, I would probably look at You're the One Who Should Disappear as your next card to add over the 4th Beji or any extra Usohachis, just as a concession to the fact that Beji's got poor timing, and your deck does run quite a few bricks, so Disappear can help alleviate that problem as well. So that is where I would be on 2K counters, and we'll move on to the next category. All right, the next category I want to go over is blockers. So I have 5 different blockers that I think are probably reasonable to put in the deck. They are this 4-cost Sanji, the 3-cost Sol, the 3-cost Brule, the 2-cost Shirahoshi, and the 4-cost purple Onami. So real quick, going over advantages to each of these. Sanji and Sol, Sanji, Sol, and Brule, these 3 all trigger out from life. Sanji at the cost of a card from hand, but he comes with a 5k body. Sol gets you a 5k body, but doesn't have counter when he's in hand. And then Brule has the weakest body, but has counter, and doesn't require a card out of hand. These are all great. They're kind of triggers. They function somewhat like Beji does, which is another reason why I feel like it's not as necessary to run all 4 Bejis, because you want to run a good number of the trigger blockers. And then the other 2, Shirahoshi has the advantage against black decks and sometimes against red decks. Shanks, outside of Beckman, this is a solid blocker that can block a 12k Shanks even. But in the context of Beckman, you want to make sure that you don't sit on it too long. And then Onami's big advantage is that she can be card neutral out of your hand at the end of the game, which can be really big. And it's also only 4, so it can fit with a lot of other plays in the deck while also holding up Gum Gum Giant and digging for Gum Gum Giant potentially at the same time. So I've been liking Onami quite a bit as well. Going on to this category, I think the way I would run it, I don't think I would run Brûlée. Just my particular list has not had enough pressure, and Brûlée does not help with that. And then I would just run 2 of each of these. I would run more Sol if I didn't have issues with non-counter cards already. So I'm making the concession to split between Sanji and Sol for that. And these are the 4 I would run. I would like to run more Onamis or more Shirahoshis potentially, but I really need to hit my trigger numbers to have enough to consistently make the deck work. So this is where I've found I'm at. So moving on to the next category. All right, the next category we have is top end. So the 5 top end cards that I would consider for the deck are Yamato, Charlotte Linlin, Katakuri, Rush 10-drop Ace, and Rush 9-drop Luffy. I think the considerations you need to consider here is a lot more matchup dependent on these. If you expect a lot more BY Luffy, then Linlin and Katakuri are the stronger ones. If you're expecting more Shanks, then Ace and Luffy can be stronger in those matchups because they're less negatively affected by the big Shanks, and they give you a better opportunity to KO the 10-drop Shanks in combat. And then if you're against Doflamingo, Yamato's the strongest. The other big consideration with top end is your defensive events, which was the next category we'll go into, but Ace is incompatible with Gum Gum Giant. So as soon as you start adding aces, even though he has a lot of upsides in that he always heals, he has rush so he can apply good pressure, he does not work with Gum Gum Giant, and there will be plenty of times where you need to rely on a Gum Gum Giant to survive. And because he only conditionally gets the rush, there are times where you won't get the rush, and it's only the heal, and sometimes that you may find yourself in a kind of precarious spot because you had to go shields down and no Gum Gum Giants. If you do run any ace, you have to run You're the One Who Should Disappear, just as a consideration. So as you're picking these out, you need to make sure that you are considering what your top end is and then what that implies for your defensive events afterwards. I really thought that the list that I ran in the Treasure Cup was pretty good on top end. If anything, you could add a single extra card, but I think that the top end that I ran is pretty close to what I want to run in general. So that looked like 2 Katakuri, 2 Linlin, 3 Yamato, and 2 Ace. That is where I found myself on top end. I found that this was a pretty good balance. The heal from all of these cards was important for bridging the gap between mid-game and end-game, and you could take life a lot more liberally, knowing that all of your top end that may be in hand would get you back up to 2. And I found that that was important. Yamato in particular is an all-star against the Dofi matchup, and then if you're running into Shanks or any of the other larger ones, then sometimes you need to consider the other 3. One thing I will say about Linlin Katakuri, you have to be a little judicious about what you put into life. If you give them too much life, you've undone too much pressure that you applied with your leader, and you might not be able to get there because you've given them too many extra chances. So that is what I would run for top end, and let's go on to the next category. All right, for the next category, which is very tied in with the previous category, we have defensive events. There are only 2 that I think work. There are a couple others that are in the viable category, but at least for my perspective, these are the best 2 and the only ones I would pick. So you have your Gum Gum Giant and You're the One Who Should Disappear. This hinges a lot on what your top end looks like. If you're running 0 ace, you can just run 4 Gum Gum Giants, and none of you're the one who should disappear. But if you're running any number of ace, you need to start switching to it. And you're the one who should disappear has the advantage that you can get rid of dead counter or dead 0 counter cards earlier in the game, whereas Gum Gum Giant, it really is just a late game card. And if you have to do Lin Lin into Gum Gum Giant, you cut yourself off of ace. So just things to consider. I think with the ratios that I picked for top end, I think I would run 3 Gum Gum Giants and 2 You're the One Who Should Disappear. This is 1 more than what I ran in the most recent Treasure Cup. But I feel like I was running into a bit of downside with counter cards and ace in particular. While very strong in the turns I could play him, there were a couple times where I couldn't, and an extra You're the One Who Should Disappear I think would help that. Moving on to the next category. The next category we have is removal. This is really important for the Doflamingo matchup in particular. So I want to focus a little bit in on it. You have removal. You can run the Egghead Nami, the Egghead Luffy. You can run Gidatsu. You can run Brachio Bomber and Kuzan. I think I consider all of these cards kind of removal as their primary purpose in the deck. So Nami is probably the strongest on its face ability because you get the KO and the body without too much restriction. It's always active as long as you have the triggers. And that trigger limitation is the one thing you have to consider. If you want to run for Nami, you are a lot more pinched on your numbers. So keep that in mind. We'll touch on it in the end, but I think that my list was potentially on the bottom edge of what was viable for Nami, so it affects where I'm at. Luffy is nice in that he always gets the card advantage on the KO, but it's at the expense of his body. So just something to keep in mind. The trigger is nearly as good. One of the issues with Nami's trigger is you are usually going card down in hand, unless she's like the last trigger, which can be really detrimental, whereas this is just card neutral on the trigger. Gidatsu is great early game, but he falls off pretty bad into the late game, and he doesn't have trigger. The +1 counter is great, so you can kind of make up for it, and he is quite strong early in that he gets the KO early with a body and without a discard like what Nami gets. So quite good, just falls off pretty hard late. Brachio Bomber is an option, no counter, so you have to be careful with the number of no counter cards you include. It does effectively draw you a card because it saves you from having to use your leader ability on the turn that you play it, which is great on 6 or 7 because it curves right into your top end without having to give up another card for your leader ability. This is particularly important if you're running extra Lin Lins, because if you lose a card to Nami for her removal and then lose a card to Lin Lin on the following turn for her removal, you can be really low on hand. And even though you've removed 2 of their bodies, if your opponent has a successful opportunity to switch into starve mode, then you can really run out of cards pretty aggressively. The final one here, we have Kuzan. Kuzan is great against early bodies and great at a lot of utility bodies. I noticed out of Shanks, it was good against Hongo, who you would try to set up to remove my top end, and I found that Kuzan was quite good there. Can be good against Blackbeard, forcing them to either start discarding early or to lose their Doc Q or Lafitte to the top of the deck and eat a card. So definitely a strong one. Worse late, but still not unusable. There's a lot of times where opponents will be playing out little cards to kind of fill board or continue doing value. Doflamingo playing stuff like Sengoku or Perona late in the game. You can get those with this. If I were building the deck today, I think the ratios I would go for is 3 Namis, 3 Egghead Luffys, no Gidatsus, no Bomber, and 2 Kuzans. So this is a little bit lower on removal than my previous lists. One of the things that it trades is, instead of running 2 Gidatsu and 1 Luffy, I'm just running 3 Luffys to keep my counter or my trigger abilities up. Running 1 less Kuzan because he's a little bit more situational. Still very strong and very nice early game to be able to play him and swing bigger with leader. But I did find he has been coming down. He's very good when he's good, but his window is a little bit smaller than I anticipated at first. And then I did shave 1 Nami here that I'm hoping that we can make up the raw removal amounts that got shaved here in my other categories. But this is where I'm at right now. Moving on to the next category. The next category we have is cards that are specifically in there for drawing cards. So the cards that I would highlight in this category would be Lucy, Jewelry Bonnie, Miss All Sunday, and probably Onami, the purple blocker one. Because I already went over her, I'll skip over her. But these are the other 3 I would consider for your draw. Aim for 4 to 8. You don't need too much. You need just enough to extend the game, give you enough counter to extend the game to finish it. And these are otherwise good options. Lucy has the upside that on your 6-on curve, when you play it on turn, 6/7s are really difficult for almost any deck to deal with. They have to invest multiple cards into it. And if they don't deal with it, then you get to just straight card draw while also interacting with board. Great against Doflamingo, good into Burgess, and a useful card to have on board to exert pressure. Bonnie is great because she has the counter and a good filtering trigger. And she has the trigger so you can discard to leader. This is one of my most frequent cards discarded to leader ability, just because it is great in the late game, but I feel like early game, it's just not usually where you want to be. Sometimes it can work against a Blackbeard. If they don't play anything on 2, you can play it on 3 and just swing 5. And then finally, we have Miss All Sunday. She has the same upside that Brachio Bomber does, in that when the turn you use her, you don't have to use leader ability, but she also draws you 1 additional card. She does not have counter, which is a pretty big downside, and her trigger is rarely like super impactful. It can be great late into the game after you've played maybe a Yamato or something like that, and you're setting up going from 10 back to 10. The trigger comes out for free. It's nice that she costs 5, so she's compatible with a lot of our blockers to do Miss All Sunday blocker plus Hold Up Giant. And then otherwise that card draw is just pretty key. So this is the category that has been the hardest to pin down. And I think if I were building it today, I would do just 2 Miss All Sundays and 2 of the Onami blockers. It is hard to find room in there, and especially because I'm trying to get more blockers into the deck. I figured Onami was a good card, and then Miss All Sunday to fill out the mid game a little bit was great. And I needed to hit my trigger counts as well, so I couldn't run Lucy in the particular list that I was building. Moving on to the next topic. Now we have the rest of the card. This is cards that you're just going to fill the rest of the slots after you've hit the other ones. Cards that I would consider in this category are Sanji, Rush Zoro, or Banish Zoro, Onami, the trigger, KO plus Banish, and then finally the Nico Robin. This category is where you're probably going to try to fill out your mid game. A couple Sanji is great potentially into Burgess or into Doflamingo. Zoro here is also great into Blackbeard in general because the 6 cost 7k, like I mentioned before, is a little hard to deal with on curve. And the having Banish on it already is great at kind of pushing on the opponent. Onami, the great trigger, helps supplement your KO if you have to trim KO. But also the Banish can be relevant if you can stick a Kuzan or another early body, then you can swing Banish with your leader and Banish with a character and set up for a Katakuri, put her back into life and get the KO again. So a lot of different things to like on Onami, all in a package that can sometimes be situational, but it always just has a trigger so you can pitch it to lead. And then finally, the Nico Robin, one of the more exciting cards that people thought for the deck, and I think will be more relevant into OP10, but for now is just kind of a middle thing. I have found that this one can be quite useful in finishing a game, especially if you've had to give your opponent several extra life through Kuzans or Big Moms or Katakuris. If you have them on 3 life, you can play out Nico Robin and then swing, and get there places where your opponent would thought that they were safe by just deleting one of their life. I think if I'm building it today, I would do 0 of those 2 Sanjis. This goes along with the shaving removal elsewhere. I would do 2 Onamis, again, focusing on making room, getting triggers, and then just 1 Nico Robin. So these 2 different cards in particular to help supplement my KOs that I had to take out, and then 1 Nico Robin because I feel almost like it's required for the deck just as a flavor thing. It fits the deck well, and I think in OP10 it'll be even better than it is now. So that is the deck. Give me a sec and I will be back with the full list laid out. All right, here the list is all laid out. Just for the record, this card in the glare is Onami, and we have Saul and Shirahoshi next to it. So looking at this whole list, I think the thing to consider if you are going to be doing any tweaking, and this is probably true of most Robin lists, is consider what pieces you have of flexibility, because your deck is constrained pretty heavily by the number of 0 counter cards it can run, the number of trigger cards it has to run, and the number of top end you run. You kind of need to hit certain thresholds for each of those categories. So consider all your changes in perspective of that. For example, if you're looking at your 2Ks, we've got Olvia, Beji, Frankie, and Usohachi. If you find that you have extra triggers that you've picked up elsewhere in the thing, you could consider cutting a trigger here to add Beji to add to Usohachi, or cutting a Frankie to add to Usohachi, which would improve your ability to finish the game without negatively affecting your ability to counter. If you are looking at the removal, if you find that you are a little bit extra on triggers, you can run extra Namis. If you find that you have sufficient triggers, you can run more Kuzan or run a Gadatsu or something like that. If you're looking at your top end and you feel like you want to add in another top end, you probably want to shave it from one of your 0 counter cards, maybe a Sol or a Miss All Sunday, and then replace that card by increasing or decreasing a card with no trigger and adding in its place a card with trigger. So if you wanted to add in maybe a Rush Luffy, you could maybe take out a Miss All Sunday, take out a Kuzan, and then add in another Monkey D. Luffy or another Nami, which would be net effect of a 0 with a 0, a trigger with a trigger, and a 1K with a 1K. Your ratios all stay about the same. You've just adjusted the kind of ratios. Your yeah, I think that makes sense. Other things you can do, if you need more removal and top end, you can consider something like a Sanji, who's a little bit in between the two, has advantage swinging at life, while also not necessarily being a counterless card. Cards with trigger can be shuffled around as well. You have your Onami here, which can supplement your removal, but only in the triggers. But if you have a density of triggers, then sometimes that makes up for the card that you're taking out. So all little considerations to make. And then once you have your removal, your top end, your 2Ks kind of sorted out, then you want to try to find the right mix of cards that can push for pressure and cards that can give you card advantage to last a little longer. And then you go from there trying to find a balance. This is what I've come up with. There are definitely other ways to play it, but this is what has been working reasonably well for me. The biggest downside, I think, to my list currently is the Shanks matchup, which, depending on your locals, may be really popular or may be really uncommon. At my locals, we have at least one Shanks who shows up, and we rarely have Dofi show up. But I always want to respect Dofi because it is the best deck in format, so it can always show up and spike an event, so I like to be prepared for that. And then, yeah, I think that this list has plenty of little knobs you can turn, and I find it really entertaining, and I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about it. I will add the list to the description, and yeah, send it on back to other Matt for the wrap-up. I'll talk to you later. Hey everybody, back again. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I want to thank you all for kind of coming out and supporting me. I am approaching 500 subscribers, so if you have been enjoying my videos and haven't yet subscribed, go ahead and hit that button and join in. I will be doing a 500 subscriber giveaway, which hopefully get to hit soon, and I'm hoping to do something a little splashier than my last giveaway, as a thank you to all the support you guys have been giving me. So again, if you haven't subscribed, I'd really appreciate it if you did. Otherwise, like and comment for the algorithm, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks.